It's a pleasure to take part in this debate and congratulate my honourable friend in securing it. Across my constituency in Mansfield, there are many fathers either in single-parent families or taking a significant role in childcare responsibilities. And it's important we recognise the invaluable role that fathers play in bringing up their children, which isn't always an easy job, lots to look forward to. But as my honourable friend said, I've got 2 children myself under 5, 2 boys. And I know that parenthood can be a huge challenge. Becoming a father is my proudest achievement, even more so than being elected to this place, can you believe? And something that has entirely changed my life. Often I've found, in my own experience, those parenting support groups are aimed largely at mothers, and some fathers can struggle in those early days and weeks and years even to find support networks and others in a similar position. My honourable friend talked about statistics in terms of fathers feeling like a spare part throughout pre- and postnatal discussions and services, and that does mirror my own experience too. My honourable friend from East Renfrewshire talked about being sent home from hospital. My first son was born in the middle of the night, and I was out of the hospital within 45 minutes of that happening. I came back the next morning at kind of 8 o'clock to be told I wasn't going to be allowed in until visiting time at 10:30. I did manage to find my way in, fortunately, in the end. But that is just one example of the challenges. The other one that I remember well is around breastfeeding. And my first son was breastfed. No, my first son was bottle fed, and I got to get involved in that, and I got to feed him, and I got to connect with him in that way. And my second son was breastfed, and I remember feeling so left out of that bonding process, and jealous, in a way, as my honourable friend said, of that connection between my wife and my son that I wasn't able to engage with. So there are many examples of difficult and stressful circumstances that bring about those emotions that aren't necessarily helpful or healthy in that environment. So young fathers need support, and I wanted to highlight the particular challenge representing the community that I do in Mansfield of working class families and fathers on low incomes in particular, with additional challenges of things like accessing housing or affording parental leave. Obviously, mental health challenges are not based on our wealth or our background, and we are all susceptible to those difficulties. Whilst it's widely acknowledged that working class boys, for example, are likely to have lower educational attainment, lower life chances, it isn't, I don't think, acknowledged that those extra difficulties and challenges might also extend to this kind of thing, to parenthood. And the additional challenge of low incomes and trying to afford the cost of living and the additional costs of parenthood is an additional stress that often falls on fathers in particular. We all know the shocking statistics around young men's mental health and suicide in particular, and those early weeks and months after having a first child in particular can be amongst the most stressful time in a family's life and in a father's life, and a difficult one to cope with for our own mental health and well-being. Since becoming an MP, one of the areas that I have looked at in particular has been early intervention, both for families and for children. I took part in the Family Hubs debate that took place in this place not so long ago. And it seems obvious that if families don't receive that early assistance when they first need it and they're left to deal with those issues alone, then that comes out in later life. As has been mentioned, those challenges in the early years show themselves later on through school, and for children with their own mental health and behavioural problems throughout school that often come at much greater cost to public services later on if we don't get the early intervention. And the Children's Society has produced some pretty shocking statistics that say in Nottinghamshire alone there are 1,000 children known to children's services because of abuse and neglect. A figure that we must bring down, we must reduce, and we can do that, I think, by being more proactive and providing those early intervention and support services in early parenthood, and that training and support and help for fathers and mothers about their roles and responsibilities and the support that's available to raise children. I strongly believe that a preventative approach is the right one. We tend to deal with crises throughout these services, and increasingly, I think, services built around crisis management rather than proactive and preventative support. But putting an emphasis on parenthood and establishing relationships between fathers and support services has to be a priority. The trust is hugely important. I remember my own experience of having social services visit after the birth of my eldest son, and when they sent me out of the room to get a glass of water, and they asked my wife if I was abusing her, and that's something that they do in all circumstances and is the right thing to do, and to check that that family environment is safe for mother and baby. But I remember feeling pretty put out by that. Fortunately, my wife kind of joked about it with me afterwards. But also, you know, if you are a young man from a difficult background who's had problems at school, who's been involved with social services historically, I imagine that can really add to the feeling of being labelled and being, you know, held up as a bad person and a bad character by the services that are meant to be supporting you, and can add to the challenges and the stress. So another thing perhaps that might need to be more openly discussed, I think, in terms of the challenges that face perhaps young, low-income, working-class fathers in particular. Nottinghamshire County Council is striving to put forward more coordinated and multi-agency support. I think that's absolutely vital, and the more we can do to reduce barriers between services, which across the piece seem to be such a challenge in terms of competing budgets and priorities, making services more difficult to deliver. I'd welcome anything that the Minister can do to try and bring down those barriers between local authorities and health services that always exist. I'm talking about children's services with the County Council in Nottinghamshire. That coordination and support from the health service in particular is not always there. That's a particular ask that I would have of the Minister. As I've said, using that funding effectively, catching problems early and dealing with early preventative services to prevent people spiralling into crisis, and actually saving money in much more intensive intervention later is absolutely vital if we're going to support children and families, and in particular fathers in communities like Mansfield, but also across the country.